about a wonderful new book, Here Comes the Sun, the spiritual and musical journey of George Harrison. George Harrison went on a remarkable spiritual journey, died at the age of 58 of cancer, but left behind a legacy of spiritual search that we think is going to interest you very much. And remember how important this legacy was. It resonated through our world, through the music of the Beatles and of George Harrison in a huge way. So this is an important journey. It's important for those of us who are seeking in this direction to understand just what happens when a seeker like George Harrison connects with the public, the energy of the large-scale public. Now, for our subscribers, I have been, as I've said before, struggling for some time to try to get into words some of the more unusual and difficult things that I have experienced. Particularly now, I have focused on time travel and movement through time because as improbable, as impossible as this seems, it seems also to be a feature of my experience and a feature of the experience of many other people who have had sort of lives at the edge of reality. And when something happened a few weeks ago that was so huge in this area for me, the first really gigantic experience I've had in quite a few years, well, I thought it was time to start talking about it. So for subscribers, I will be talking about my experiences with time travel. Now, here's William.
People want to know, how can I make a difference in the world? How can I change things? I'm just a little person in a big world. What are some steps that I can do? One quote-unquote little man from Liverpool, England, picked up a guitar one day, a relatively simple act. He joined with a few friends who called themselves the Beatles, and together they became a singular force that changed the world. Like the sacred Khepera beetle of ancient Egypt, they pushed the light of the sun into our world. Everyone knows the ringing chang of the first chord of A Hard Day's Night. Rolling Stone calls it the most famous chord in all of rock and roll. That chord is rock and roll. It is a holy grail chord of and for the ages, and it was a wake-up call. That chord had the tones, the words, the harmonics to create the energy that jump-started the spiritual pulse of a generation and catapulted us into a transformative timeline, which continues to this very day. That chord came through George Harrison's famous Rickenbacker 360 12-string electric guitar, but our guest today will give us inspiration to wonder if it originally came from a deeper place, a connection that George Harrison had to Krishna consciousness, to God consciousness, Christ consciousness, enlightenment, a connection that his soul treasured and now carries into another realm. Joshua Greene is a historian, an Emmy Award-nominated author and filmmaker who knew George Harrison. His book, Here Comes the Sun, explores the spiritual and musical journey of Harrison. Joshua currently teaches mysticism and the spiritual quest at Hofstra University, and this conversation today will not be about the Beatles or other crap, as Harrison might have called it. It will be about a soul's journey, the intimate story of a little man who reached the pinnacle of earthly success and found that there was more to life than untold riches and messianic fame. Joshua, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you, and thank you for that extraordinary introduction as well. That was beautiful.
Well, thank you, sir. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. Just for your background knowledge, we cover a lot of ground on Dreamland: UFOs, mysticism, spirituality, mythology, planetary awakening. So please feel free to express yourself in the deepest sense of the word.
Well, thank you. It's nice to find a soulmate at the other end of the line.
Terrific. There are more than 1,000 books, you note, about the Beatles. In checking Google this morning, there's over 18,800,000 web pages chronicling their lives. That's compared to the 29 million for the life of Jesus Christ. We just can't seem to get enough of this transformation that was sparked in the early 1960s. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, that was an extraordinary time that will never happen again for a number of reasons. Not only was there a development historically in modes of thought. Remember the time. This is just 20 years after the end of World War II, and the baby boomers, as that crop of post-war children have come to be known, were seeking alternative forms of resolution to conflict. They didn't want to have to turn to war anymore to resolve differences. So there was already an openness to peaceful cultures such as that from India. There was also an explosion of technology. When the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, there were only 3 networks at the time. So most of the country was already focused on watching that show. The same thing happened in England. They appeared on television at a time when there was really only one popular show to watch, especially on a cold winter night. That was the Beatles' debut in England on television. So there were those influences. There was also an influence that I think we can't quite describe as empirically, and that's an evolution of consciousness. The Beatles came along at a time when we were ready for other modes of thinking and feeling and being. Science and technology hadn't exactly played themselves out, but they had proven themselves to be fallible soldiers, if you will, against the adversities of life. And here we had young men riding above the wave of all of the paranoia of the time, the Vietnam War, the Kennedy assassination, the King assassination, all of these things were taking place on a conscious level. And here they were riding above that with a sense of joy and happiness about life. That was absolutely irresistible. I don't know. I wonder if it's possible for someone who wasn't growing up as I was. How old are you, William? I'm 55. How old are you?
You're 55. Yeah, I was born in 1962, so I kind of rode the wave of all you need is love with the vibration in the air. But I know exactly what you're talking about, Joshua. A good friend of Dreamland is Sir Lawrence Gardner. He's a well-known British author, and at one of his talks, he waxed, just poetic about the time of that post-World War II London and how difficult life was and the drudgery of life, that all the American kids were going to university, but here they had to work to support his family. And all of a sudden, here comes a new kind of music led by Elvis. And at that instant, it really clicked for me how much this really meant to people and how much that changed people. And that was Lawrence's point, that he traces his spiritual evolution back to that moment when all of a sudden this new vibe started to spread around the world.
Mm-hmm. It's remarkable as well when you think that today it's a commonplace thing to find classes on yoga, courses on meditation. My course at Hofstra on mysticism isn't really all that far-fetched. Back then, when George Harrison was still just embarking on his spiritual journey back in the mid to late 60s, you could open up a newspaper and not find one ad for a yoga class. I mean, that stuff was very far out back then. So George really needs to be credited for having put a lot on the line, his credibility, his fame, his success, his following. When he started publicly talking about the power of chanting, like you mentioned earlier, the Hare Krishna mantra, the Krishna consciousness that he started to get into, and then the other forms of meditation, that was taking a real risk. It's not like it is today, where it's fairly commonplace.
Well, it still happens today. Even the regular host of our show, Whitley Strieber, was a famous author, a fiction writer who had an extraordinary experience with ETs called Greys, and he started to share that message, and all of a sudden his life changes overnight in dramatic ways. And the exact same thing happened to George Harrison, didn't it? That as soon as he starts revealing his inner spiritual message, a lot of people rejected him.
Yeah, we humans tend to be afraid of the things we don't understand. And even if the descriptions of those things are coming from people we know and love or trust, it's asking a lot of people to put aside the modalities of thought, the rational, logical thinking that they've grown up with, and to begin thinking of things, viewing the world through a different, more spiritual, abstract lens. It's a scary proposition for most people. The thing that I admire most about George, and the reason why I wrote the book Here Comes the Sun, was as a form of thank you to George for having undertaken the spiritual journey with real integrity, I mean, George was not, woo-woo, wishy-washy type of guy. He was a real kind of on the ground. He was the one among the Beatles who took the most interest, for example, in their finances and how the accounting and the bookkeeping was being set up. He was the one who was methodical when he got involved with learning to play guitar as a young man. He was up till 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning learning that guitar. When he got involved in sports car racing, he would go to the very best drivers to find out what is the art of driving. When he got involved in gardening, he evolved to a point of being one of the finest gardeners in all of England. I mean, this was someone who was very pragmatic. So he approached his spiritual life in the same way and went to the traditional texts, was not afraid to undertake the discipline of spiritual life. I mean, there's a discipline to it, You don't get good stuff without sacrificing something. And that's true spiritually as well as materially. For George, it meant cleaning up his act, following certain principles, giving up the drugs, giving up as far as possible bad habits, rising early, chanting the mantras every day as a kind of morning meditation. So he was an exemplar, an early exemplar for those of us alive today. Unlike the books on mysticism, where most of the people you read about, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, George Harrison may be the best example we have of a contemporary journeyer undertaking the spiritual quest with real integrity.
Yeah, and that's why I was so excited to see your book, because that vibe clearly comes through in his life story. And even when you begin to now add the dimension of knowing where George came from and what this meant to him and what some of these songs were really about, all of a sudden the songs themselves take on the effect of a mantra and begin to open up a whole new dimension of your awareness if you allow that to happen. One of the things I'd like to...
Quite true.
I'd like to, just for the benefit of our listeners, to kind of go back to the beginning for a moment. George Harrison, like as many people know, came from Liverpool, born in 1943. His father was a ship's steward. His mother was a housewife. And one of the most interesting things that you point out is that during her fourth pregnancy, that with George, his mother's favorite program was a radio program from Radio in India. Why was that so important to George's story?
If you look at the mystic traditions, you see that there's something that they all share in common, namely a profound and abiding respect for the power of spiritual sound. Create the right sound, and you can move worlds, you can move universes. And the fact that George, even within the womb of his mother, had the opportunity to hear these ancient ragas and sitar music and these temple sounds. I mean, these ancient melodies from India are meant for meditation. They're religious, spiritual sounds, and they're meant to evoke a sense of God. The beauty of that sound is that it goes deep and penetrates consciousness. The sitar, for example, has no frets. I mean, it's a fretless instrument where the strings bend farther than any other instrument in the world. And the effect of that bending string is to reflect or mirror the sound, for example, of a heart in love, the yearning of a heart in love. You can mirror the sounds of nature with that kind of an instrument. And properly played, and it takes a lot of practice, more than 12 years just to master the basics of the sitar. Properly played, those sounds can reawaken the dormant consciousness within us of ourselves as eternal spiritual beings. So imagine what it's like starting your life even before you're born with the opportunity to hear these spiritual sounds while you're in the womb of your mother. So that was a very auspicious beginning.
Absolutely, and absolutely incredible. And then you kind of take it forward knowing the impact that George Harrison had. How many babies were conceived to Beatles songs? How many babies in the womb listened to Beatles songs? And then later George Harrison songs. It's incredible. Following the timeline then, George was around 13 when he got his first guitar?
Yeah, I think 12 or 13, somewhere in there.
Very pivotal age. Excuse me. And let's just talk for a moment about then the rise of the Beatles, how this relationship developed with his three bandmates and where they went. But first, let's take a short break. We'll come back and we'll talk with Josh about the early days of the Beatles, George Harrison's role in those days, and then ultimately how George's consciousness began to shift and change away from the beliefs of the other Beatles. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing our conversation about the spiritual and mystical quest of George Harrison with Josh Greene. Josh, just before the break, we talked about George's early life in the womb, how he was influenced by the sound of the sitar, the spiritual sound of the sitar. Then as a young man, 12, a pivotal age, he picks up the guitar, and now he meets his bandmates. Take us through the time of his early teens into his early 20s, if you would.
Sure, with pleasure. In fact, if readers are interested, if they go to the website, herecomesthesonbook.com, there are other stories as well they can access at their leisure. Here's George, a young boy, who had the advantage of growing up with loving parents. I mean, he's the only one of the four Beatles who did not have either death or divorce early in his life. The others all did. George grew up with parents who knew to encourage him. They trusted him. They instilled in him a sense of his dignity as a human being. I had a chance to talk with George's sister, Louise, who described very eloquently how they didn't have a lot, but whatever they had, they would share equally among themselves. She said if there was one apple, each of the four kids would have a quarter. And they were always taught to not put yourself above anyone else, nor to cower before bullies. So even though George was gentle soul, he knew how to stand his ground. So when he met up with the other Beatles, we know that John had perhaps the strongest alpha male personality in the group. He was very sarcastic and cynical and had a wicked sense of humor. And whenever he would put George down, George would just give him a taste of his own and come back with with some kind of a retort of his own. So John learned to respect him, even though George was the youngest in the group. So here they are, young men. They get a chance to go to Hamburg. George was all of 17 years old at the time. And they play their first out-of-town gig in the Reeperbahn. Now, the Reeperbahn is kind of the Bowery of Hamburg, Germany, or at the time at least. It was very rough and rugged territory. You didn't walk in there without knowing how to defend yourself. You know, there's gun runners and criminals of all types, and it was the red light district, and it was a very, very dangerous area. So these guys get up on stage, young men, first time away from home, and the crowd, you know, kind of unhappy with them just doing this little nice back and forth motion that they'd seen other bands doing in England. So the crowd's going, make a show, mach show, mach show. They start cutting up and jumping up and down off the stage and pretending to beat each other up and yell back at the crowd. And all of a sudden, they're getting really popular. People start to like this energy. And that's when the Beatles themselves credit that experience with having helped shape them, releasing them and allowing them to express themselves more freely as artists and musicians and as individuals. So they come back from Germany, become very, very popular because England had not seen anything like that before, and they become, as we know, the most successful pop group in history. George is in the shadow of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting phenomenon. I mean, John Lennon and Paul McCartney are arguably, well, I think without doubt, one of the finest songwriting teams in history. And it was very hard for George to get a song in edgewise, so to speak. And it wasn't until the Beatles broke up in 1970 that George was able to really show what he was capable of doing. You know, he had all these songs gestating inside him. So his first solo recording was a 3-record set, All Things Must Pass. It was the first time in pop music history that there had ever been a 3-record set. And when they asked him about it, he said it was kind of like being constipated. He had all of these songs. He could finally kind of let them out there. So, and the collection went straight to number one on the charts in England and the U.S. And it was filled. All of the songs were filled with these spiritual discoveries that he had made. By that time, 1970, he had been to India a few times. He had integrated yoga and meditation into his morning program. He would rise each day early, set aside all of the cares and woes of whatever bickering may have been going on with the Beatles or whatever at that time, and just give himself over to the chanting. And specifically, he was interested in the Krishna mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, as a way of calming, bringing down the metabolic level, controlling breath, focusing the mind on the self within. So there's a real science to how this is done. And he would do that.
And I want to come up to that science as we progress here, Joshua. In our timeline, in the book, you note that from 1961 to 1965, Beatlemania, George had been in and out of the company of presidents, kings, luminaries of stage and screen, captains of industry, celebrities of every stripe, but no one affected him like Ravi Shankar. Talk about the relationship with Shankar.
Yeah. Ravi Shankar at that time was a about 46 or 47-year-old musical emissary from India who was and remains one of the finest sitar master performers in history. He had come to the West, specifically to England, and then traveling all over the world with the intention of bringing this spiritual music to the wider public. In Sanskrit, the term is Nada Brahma, or God and sound. And he wanted people to understand that music isn't just about, boogalooing and having a good time. It's also a channel to your deep, eternal self. Well, when George heard from friends, this is in 1965, I believe, that, there's this guy, Ravi Shankar, you should hear some of his albums. George went out and bought a few. And the way he described it was hearing, when you read the book, Here Comes the Sun, all of this is described in detail. I'm giving you a summary of it. He said it sounded very familiar. Now, whether that was because, as we were discussing, William, that he had heard sitar music when he was in his mother's womb, or whether that was a memory going back earlier than that even, we don't know. But what we do know is that George described it as like coming home to something very familiar, very comfortable, very beautiful. And that hearing Ravi Shankar play led to meeting with Ravi Shankar and taking lessons with him. And that led to his first journey for study in India. And that's when things really got going, so to speak. Because when he was there, in 66, in Kashmir, this beautiful lake-filled town at the foot of the Himalayan mountains, and my wife and I had a chance to stay on the very houseboat where George and his then-wife Patty and Ravi Shankar and his partner were staying back in the mid-60s. It's an extraordinary experience to look out your window in the morning, and the Himalayan mountains are rising up before you higher than you can even see. It's extraordinary. In that beautiful, calm, spiritual environment, George read books. Raja Yoga by Swami Vivekananda, who lived in the 1800s. He read Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramhansa Yogananda, the founder of Self-Realization Fellowship. That book, I believe, was written in the 1940s. And these were pretty much the only books at the time that were available on the science of self-realization. Later, George contacted Bhaktivedanta Swami, who was the founder of the Hare Krishna movement. And Bhaktivedanta was, I think, really the only living spiritual preceptor that George had extended contact with. But in those early days, from these books, he would read about how within the body is this unlimitedly powerful entity that we call soul. In Sanskrit, it's Atman. And by creating the proper sound, you can stimulate the energy within the soul. And he would read about yogis Is this okay? I'm going on a little bit, but it's a fascinating.
Yeah, no, I have a question I wanted to ask you in this vein about sacred sounds, sacred music.
Read about, for example, Trailanga Baba, who was a very famous mystic yogi from the mid-1800s, who could shrink himself down. He was reported to be able to shrink himself down to the size of a pea and sneak out from underneath doorways. So even though he loved to chant sitting naked in the middle of the street, this was a big guy. He weighed something like 300 pounds. When they would put him in prison, he would just shrink himself down, sneak out, go back to the middle of the street and start chanting again. George was fascinated by these stories of all these mystic yogis. So that's kind of what the beginning for him was, those stories of all of those mystic powers.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question, Joshua, about Ravi Shankar and the Indian classical music. One of the topics we discuss here on Dreamland is crop circles, which are created when wheat stalks are bent by an unknown force. Some people think sound. Are you familiar with them?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Many people believe that crop circles are believed to be a form of higher consciousness themselves. And one of the guests we had on the program was Freddie Silva, and he talked about some experiments, laboratory experiments that were done in Colorado in 1968, where they exposed plants to music. And what he found, or what this study revealed, was that in the Hindu devotional music, the type played by Ravi Shankar, the stems bent in excess of 60 degrees of the vertical, perhaps the closest that any human has ever come to recreating the right angle bend that is common to genuine crop circles. Isn't it interesting that crop circles are believed to be a form of higher consciousness or from a higher consciousness, and that Indian classical music is claimed to be similarly endowed? And now here's George Harrison, who's in a sense a flower of this seed of this music. What are we talking about here in terms of this special kind of music that so influenced George and was in fact a gateway, if you will, that allowed him to tap into this higher consciousness?
Right, excellent. Really, really, really excellent question. And here's the answer. What George discovered, and it relates directly to what you're talking about, is that anything that we call alive, whether it be a human being or a cat or a bird or a plant or a crop of plants or a field of plants, anything that we say is alive is a spark of eternal energy covered in different degrees, so that some form of life that's not yet very evolved. Well, the eternal spiritual spark is in that body, whether it's an insect body or a plant body, but it doesn't have the evolved consciousness that would allow, for example, a man or a woman to ask questions about who am I and where do I come from and where am I going. But the consciousness is still there within that life form. And consciousness responds to sound. I mean, I've had the experience of being in kirtans or the chanting parties of these ancient Sanskrit mantras. And, sometimes if it's a walking party in public, you can go up and down streets with drums and the kartal hand cymbals and chanting these mantras. You'll see dogs coming and chanting along and jumping up and down. It's a beautiful, beautiful sound. And there are plants in India, for example, the tulsi plant, which resembles a sweet basil, that is reputed to only grow, only thrive in places where that kind of spiritual sound exists. So it wouldn't be a surprise that entire fields of plant life would respond to the proper kind of sound. And that's why George, now forgive me for always coming back to the book, Here Comes the Sun, but this is the
Joshua,
idea.
Can you hold that thought? We have to take a quick break.
You bet.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Josh Greene. Josh, just before the break, we were talking about George's connection and flowering as a result of his contact with this higher form of music, this classical Indian music. Let's continue our conversation on that, because you were holding a thought during the break.
Well, the thought was this. If you look at George Harrison's life, what you see is the evolution of consciousness. He gifted us with that allowance to come inside his life and watch him as he progressed spiritually. And what we see is someone who went from the bubblegum music of those early Beatles rock and roll days to someone who was the decisive spiritual influence on the Beatles' later music, where they became more socially relevant and more spiritually relevant. I mean, these things happened, well, first through LSD and the contact with that hint that there are other levels of perception and reality. But more significantly, bringing the Beatles with him to India in 1968, which was the birth of what we now call the White Album, and all the beautiful music that came out in those later years. What we see is the evolution of someone from simple material forms of music, maybe pleasing music, but still material, to more subtle forms of music, and then all the way into spiritual music. When George started recording, first with the Radha Krishna Temple in 1969, 1970, the Govinda prayer and the Govinda Jaya Jaya mantra and the Hare Krishna mantra, and then from there, with Ravi Shankar recording some of the original traditional chants of India. That's an extraordinary album, Chants of India, which was released, I believe, in 97. There you have the expression of someone in full spiritual maturity who recognizes that in that original sound you have all of the full potency of God's names. There's no need to invent an English language version of it. What you have is the original spiritual sound. You know, in the Vedic scriptures, the Sanskrit scriptures of India, there's the same idea that we find in the Bible, where it says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And God said, let there be creation. So the first element is sound. That's there in the Vedas as well. The sound that the Vedas describe as the primordial sound is the Pranav Omkara, or the Om mantra. And that chanting of that Om mantra is an evoking of the original creative energy of the universe. So you're putting yourself in touch with that original, creative, unlimitedly powerful, energetic source just by chanting that one sound. The difference between Om and the recording that George made of Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, is that Om is formless. It comes from a place that is devoid of differentiation. The Hare Krishna mantra is a mantra with form. It speaks directly to God in person as Krishna, and Hare, which is the energy of God or love of God. Though that formulation of those 16 words in that mantra is recommended in the life and time that we are in now as more joyful, as easier to chant. It's called the Yuga Dharma, or the spiritual practice for the age that we're in currently. George arguably did more than anyone else to popularize that very traditional Yuga Dharma sound of the Hare Krishna mantra. An amazing, amazing accomplishment.
Yeah, and you note that with the release of the Hare Krishna mantra, the term Hare Krishna suddenly was being chanted around the world, and you note that in doing so, George was actually helping to fulfill a prophecy dating from the 16th century. Tell us about that.
Yeah, very good. I'm glad you picked up on that. In the 16th century, there was, according to the Sanskrit texts, the most recent authorized, scheduled incarnation of God. If someone claims to be an incarnation of God, you have the right to ask them, well, can you show me where in the scriptures your appearance is predicted? You can't just, claim to be a doctor. Why should you claim to be an avatar of God? You have to have the credentials. So those credentials are described. The appearance of Buddha, for example, 2,600 years ago approximately, was anticipated in these ancient Sanskrit texts. The place of Buddha's appearance, his mother's name, physical symptoms on his body, the nature of his mission, all of these things are predicted there. Chaitanya's appearance is similarly foretold in these ancient texts. He appeared in India, and his specific purpose was to propagate this chanting of Hare Krishna as the most joyful spiritual practice in the age that we are in now, an age of confusion when there's very little attention span and, people are kind of, life is hard in this age. So that chanting that Chaitanya gave was an easy formula. George knew about that because when he met the Krishna devotees and then when he studied with Bhaktivedanta Swami, he learned about the history of India's ancient spiritual culture, the Vedic culture. So I think, from the little bit of time that I had with him back in the early 70s, that he did have some sense that he was fulfilling this prophecy that the chanting of Hare Krishna would travel to every town and village of the world. But it was nothing that he ever got, proud of or full of himself. That was the one thing about George when you spent time with him. He was a really, really warm, normal guy. He was a wonderful guy, friendly, self-effacing. He wasn't full of himself. He wasn't proud and puffed up. In fact, if you talked with him like a regular human being, he was there for you. As soon as you would start talking to him like a Beatle, he would walk away.
I want to ask you a question about Krishna. What is the time? I've seen that he died or existed around 3000 BC. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's the tradition says that Krishna is. We've been talking about the incarnations. The Sanskrit word for incarnation is avatar.
Mm-hmm.
Krishna, according to the Vedic text, is avatari, meaning that he is the source of all other avatars. And his last personal appearance, according to the tradition, was about 5,000 years ago in a beautiful town. In fact, I was just there about 3 months back, called Vrindavan. It's a 2-hour or 2.5-hour drive south of Delhi. It's an ancient, beautiful little village surrounded by forests. And in this 20-odd square mile village, there's more than 5,000 temples to Krishna. So all day and night, you'll hear the chanting, the beautiful instruments, the songs, the prayers, the hymns. They're going on 24 hours a day.
So about 5,000 years ago, 3000 BC is a good date to fix that on, then, that incarnation?
Yeah, I would say that pretty much anyone from the Indian devotional tradition would agree with that date.
And here's why I asked, Joshua. It's because something happened around 3000 BC. 3114 BC, that's year 0 in the Mayan calendar, which ends in December 2012. 3102 BC, that's year 0 of the Kali Yuga. The first king of the unified Egypt was called Menes, and that unification took place around 3000 BC. Stonehenge was built around this time. And what I wonder was the appearance or even the disappearance of Krishna, if you will, the crash of an enlightened consciousness that was possibly brought about by massive earth changes. And the reason I ask that is because the Maya talk of a 5,000-year-old cycle of destruction, which it appears that we're in. And so here we have this figure, George Harrison, who, as much as anybody, embodies this consciousness or certainly points to it as a gateway to a better realm. Talk about the coincidence of those dates and the appearance of George Harrison at the time that he emerged.
Yeah, William, you're right to bring that up. First of all, the word Maya is a Sanskrit word. It refers to the illusory material world that we live in. So they're etymologically, you'll find those roots. Also, in the ancient Hindu cosmic vision of the universe, there are 4 ages. It was 5,000 years ago that the current age, Kali Yuga, or Age of Confusion, began. So you'll see that reflected in the many cultures that you mentioned.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with our guest, Josh Greene. Josh, just before the break, we have talked about this idea of the Kali Yuga and this age of darkness. I wanted to kind of shift gears just for a quick moment. Let's talk about some songs. George Harrison is considered a great musician and singer. He's the man who gave us what some call the Big Three. Here Comes the Sun, Something, which Sinatra called one of the greatest love songs to have been written in the last 50 years, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. All 3 songs, you note, have profound spiritual meaning They were enormous career risks, and yet embodied with them is a profound message. Can you talk for us a moment about these songs? Tell us about Something first and its inner spiritual meaning.
When George wrote Something, it started in November of '68 when he was spending Thanksgiving with Bob Dylan in Woodstock. And he brought it back in December when he returned and started finishing that song. And according to what he told some Krishna devotee friends, it's about God. It's not about love of woman per se or man and woman. It's about his love for God. But George, who had a great sense of humor, put it this way. He said, I had to write something in the way she moves, because if I wrote something in the way he moves, they'd think I'm a poof, British slang for gay. So sometimes people got confused because a lot of George's songs seem to equate love for God with the love between a man and a woman. Mm-hmm. And he described it, often that was intentional on his part. He says, I think that when we really love someone, there is something spiritual to that, and it's a reflection of the eternal love that the soul has with the Supreme Soul or God. So that was a beautiful expression of his spiritual search.
The next song, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, what's the spiritual meaning within that song?
Well, here you have a song written at a time when the shock of his spiritual discovery included a kind of rude awakening to the state of affairs in the material world. And psychologically, if you just read the lyrics to While My Guitar Gently Weeps, what you have is someone standing somewhat aloof, someone who looks at the suffering condition of people in the material world and weeps over it. It's not the voice of a prophet. It's not the voice of someone actively engaged in going out there and doing something about it. He says, I look at the floor and I see that it needs sweeping. Well, pick up a broom and, go do it. This is more of a detached observation on the human condition, that it's a discouraging place, this material world, and if you're at all sensitive, you weep. You have to feel for what other people are going through, and I think that was an expression of his sensitivity and ultimately something that came out even more memorably in many ways in the concert for Bangladesh. I mean, I interviewed a lot of people for this book, Here Comes the Sun, and when you read the book, you'll read things that people confided to me, and they were more interested in George as a doer, as a spiritual activist. They didn't remember too much about the philosophy, and he could go on about the philosophy, and he loved to talk philosophy. His friends were, okay, that's nice, George, that's your thing, But what they really admired was that he actively went out there and tried to make a difference in the world, because he knew that real spirit is something that can improve and heal and change the world. So we get hints of that in While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Right, and to repeat a sentiment we've already expressed, after his passing, his friend Deepak Chopra said that you can look around the American landscape, the American spiritual landscape now, and you can't go to a health club that doesn't have yoga, and churches are now teaching meditation. If Harrison and the Beatles hadn't done what they did, Chopra questions if that would have even happened. And so can you imagine an America without meditation? I mean, talk about a mess.
Well, what's remarkable in all of that as well is, and I think George would second this, there's nothing Hindu about it. There's nothing Indian about it. I mean, the word yoga is Sanskrit for to join or to link up, like the word yoke, which connects two bulls, or union. So the concept of yoga, the practice of yoga, is simply linking ourselves with the divine, And that's there in every tradition. I mean, you will not hear any enlightened person or any real spiritual teacher telling you that you have to convert, that you've got to give up this in order to become that. That's not what it's all about. It's about realizing what we are already. And what we are is eternal parts and parcels of the divine, of the supreme being that is the source of all creation. That's the spirituality that George was into. So I think that's important to see that he wasn't interested in preaching Hinduism or something. In fact, he talked more about Christ consciousness than anything else.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because, again, Deepak Chopra mentioned that, of course, there's this very deep and profound connection between Krishna and Christ, and several historians have listed out the similarities between the two. And in an article, Chopra had mentioned that George was a deep reader, an avid reader, especially of Gnostic Christian texts, especially the Gospel of Thomas, finding tremendous wisdom within those books.
Yeah, I first of all, I think it's important to recognize that Krishna was a historic person. I mean, this isn't just an idea or a concept or an energy. When the texts talk about Krishna, they're talking about God in human form. So there's a historic person in the name Krishna. That said, Krishna consciousness, or to give oneself in devotion to God, is the same concept that we find in Christianity. It's the same concept that we find in Judaism. It's the same concept that we find in all true theistic religions of the world, that there is us, the small living beings, and then there is the great, there is God. And to give ourselves to God is the ultimate fulfillment of human life. So there is that. But having said that, one can reach that state of enlightenment through many, many different paths. And, the chanting of the Krishna mantra is very much like the chanting on rosary, for example, or in the Bible where it says, to glorify the name of God, or in Islam where it talks about, the name of Allah as the, expression of our love for God. These things are universal. And I think George, one of the things that always impressed me was how much he got that. What an amazing guy he was. All right, I'll admit it, I'm prejudiced. I really love this guy. We're lucky to have lived in the same time that he was around. He did so much. He got it. He was about as far away from a fanatic as you can get. I mean, he had his moments of enthusiasm. He would get up on stage sometimes and just yell out to the audience, chant Christ, chant Allah, chant Buddha, chant Krishna, whatever name you have, It's good for you. I mean, sure, he had those moments like that when he was young. I think as he got older, went more inside, But he understood. He understood that all people, whatever they call themselves, whatever their tradition or religion, they can access the divine.
Yeah. Josh, we've only got a few minutes left. I have so much more I wanted to ask you, but one of the things that I found most interesting that I didn't know about George Harrison until I read the book was his love of gardening. I mean, that's another Christ-like energy or archetype that he tapped into, because that was the last act. That's the last appearance of Jesus in the Bible, or in the four Gospels, as a gardener. And George discovered a love of nature while in India, and it sort of allowed him to sort of tap into that green man archetype. Let's talk about that just for a moment, please.
Well, in the book, Here Comes the Sun, there's, I guess, almost an entire chapter dedicated to how in his later years, I mean, he died in November of 2001. It was, ostensibly from cancer. That the George that emerged from that youthful Beatle in his early years was a mature spiritual visionary who recognized God in God's creation. and he gave himself over to nature. First of all, remember that privacy was very important to him. I mean, throughout his whole life, these poor guys, the Beatles, they were just beset by everybody. They couldn't go into their hotel room without having some teeny bopper jump out at them with a pen and an autograph book from under the bed or in the closet or something. So they never really had much privacy, and sometimes it turned very tragic, as we know that John Lennon was so horribly killed by someone who had just fixated on him. People don't fixate on people who are unknown; they fixate on celebrities. So having his privacy was very important to him, but spiritually also, to be able to nurture a plant, to grow a flower, to prune a tree, to free a bush from brambles, to restore the world to its natural harmony. I mean, that for him was an act of meditation. And you're quite right. He had seen that in India. In India, they talk about nature as God's universal form. It's called the Virata Rupa. The entire universe being the manifestation of God, that in a way that our materially conditioned eyes can see. So the rivers and lakes and streams are the blood running through the veins of God, and the mountains are the bones, and the clouds are the hair. And I mean, it's a way of visualizing God in the world. And for George, I think he took great comfort in that, and created at his place, Friar Park, west of London, one of the most beautiful gardens in all of England.
Yep, for 10 years I lived in between Johnny Cash and Roy Orbison, and our street was a parade. You never knew if you were going to see Bono or Chris Christopherson, Waylon Jennings, Tom Petty. All these guys kept coming through, and as I watched them and observed it, I got this idea in my head. You know what? These guys have known each other from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, and this is what they do. They come together, and they rock this planet from time to time with music, with an energy or a vibe. And that's why I was so kind of thrilled to see that George seemed to have that kind of sense about John, Paul, and Ringo. In the few seconds we have left here, can you just kind of tap on this for a moment and talk about where George thought he was headed in his next incarnation or the next life?
You know what? I don't think it mattered to him. I don't think that George was the kind of person who was living his life in order to go to a heaven afterwards. I think George saw heaven right here, right now, the life that he had. And he didn't always see it like that. I mean, he was an angry, bitter guy for a while. But he came to a point through the chanting and the yoga and the meditation where he gave up. He was able to let go of the bitterness. And I think for him, he reflected the teachings of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, which describes that this world is also the spiritual kingdom. You have to see it that way, and if you act on that level, you'll understand it and realize it. So I think he got it. By the time he left this world, he was already in a very, very spiritual place. I don't think he was necessarily hoping to go to some heaven afterwards. He had already achieved liberation and peace.
So Earth is rock and roll heaven. Josh, it's been an amazing conversation with you today. I hope you'll keep us in mind and come back and have another conversation with us. The book is Here Comes the Sun, The Spiritual and Musical Journey of George Harrison. It's published by Wiley. It's a great book. And thank you again so much, Josh.
You're about to experience something you can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science, discovery, and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts the others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week, she's reporting on that strange object on Mount Ararat. Could it really be the remains of a boat? Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Before my report about the Mount Ararat anomaly, as it's known, I have a news update on the ever-spreading and deadly H5N1 avian virus that is called bird flu. This past week, Jordan reported its first cases of dead domestic turkeys caused by H5N1. The infected turkey farm is about 20 miles north of Jordan's capital of Amman. H5N1 has also killed birds in the surrounding region of Israel, Palestinian-occupied territories, and killed both birds and some humans in Egypt. There are 2,500 farms in Jordan that raise at least 6 million poultry. The fear is also a plunge in that poultry economy following the 70% decline in Europe after H5N1 spread into poultry farms there and consumers stopped buying chicken and other bird meats. Even though there is no evidence that eating cooked meat can cause any problem, it is simply now the fear of birds. Also in Cambodia, a 3-year-old girl died of H5N1, bringing the human death toll now for this planet from bird flu in some 10 countries to at least 104 out of at least 185 confirmed cases. The World Health Organization reported that the child was from farm country west of Phnom Penh, who developed a fever on March 14th. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. She was taken to a Phnom Penh hospital on March 20th and died the next day. Tissue and fluid samples from the girl did test positive for H5N1 infection at the Pasteur Institute in Cambodia. It is thought that she might have touched chickens that were sick and dying from bird flu. The question is if or when the H5N1 virus will mutate to one that adapts to humans so it can spread through cough, sneezes, or close contact. Recent medical research shows that it would not take much mutation for the H5N1 to shift its structure a bit to fit on to human cell receptors. But so far, over the 9 years the virus has been known on our Earth, it has mercifully not made such a change. Our American Department of Agriculture is expecting H5N1 to show up in Alaska and North America sometime soon as migratory birds fly from Asia on their normal seasonal routes. The department plans to increase the number of wild birds it screens for the H5N1 virus. Now to that mystery on the western plateau of Mount Ararat. A CIA spy satellite photographed an unusual feature in the glacier back in 1973 during its Cold War observation missions of the Turkey-Russia border. But there was never any news because the satellite was not to be discussed in the interest of national security. 20 years later, in 1993, a retired CIA official confirmed an anomaly on Mount Ararat was photographed in 1973. And recently, a professor at the University of Richmond in Virginia has talked to the media about a more recent satellite photograph taken on February 1st, 2003, which he has been having analyzed by various intelligence experts. His name is Portia Taylor, an associate professor of paralegal studies in the School of Continuing Studies at the University of Richmond. Recently, he told me about how he first became interested in that 1973 CIA satellite photo and his hope that new satellite imagery might provoke scientists to do a serious investigation at the 15,300-foot site on the western plateau. Mount Ararat has long been linked to a Bible story about Noah building a big boat to collect all the world's animals in pairs before a global flood. Here are some brief excerpts from chapters 6 through 8 in the King James Version about the Lord's instructions to Noah. Quote, "Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make of it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it." Unquote. There is no explanation in the Bible about what gopher wood is, or what the exact length of a cubit is. However, religious scholars estimate a cubit maybe is 19 inches or half a meter. So 300 cubits would be maybe 450 feet long, bigger than a football field. Genesis chapter 7 describes the 40 days and nights of rain and flood that lasted for 150 days. The flood lasted for 150 days. Quoting from Genesis chapter 8, quote, "And the waters returned from off the earth continually. And after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat," unquote. That's the King James Version. Mount Ararat is a volcano that rises 16,945 feet high in eastern Turkey on the borders of Iran and Armenia, which was formerly the Soviet Union. A local mythology has evolved over a long time from residents in the region about people who have seen a large boat sticking out of a glacier. But to date, no one has ever agreed on a location or photographed such a discovery. Although that western plateau featured in the spy satellite photos is where some locals have pointed when asked about the Noah's Ark legend. Here now is Professor Portia Taylor from the University of Richmond explaining how he first learned about the 1973 CIA satellite photo and what he has learned since.
In 1973, as a cadet on the debate team at the United States Military Academy at West Point, I first heard the very powerful rumor that was ricocheting off the walls at that time that one of our CIA KH-9 spy satellites accidentally imaged what appeared to be the bow of a huge ship sticking up out of the glacier on Mount Ararat at about 14 or 15,000 feet.
Mm-hmm. Was that suppressed back then as private intelligence information?
It was something that could not be spoken about on the public record or publicized because it was taken by classified technology. At the time, that particular space-based system had a certain high resolution that certainly would not be conducive to national security to allow the public or potential or actual enemies at that time, that's during the Cold War in 1973, of course, to know about the true capability of our reconnaissance satellite systems that were keeping a very close eye at the time on the Soviet Union and the like.
So how long did it take for that information to finally surface to the public?
20 years later, in 1993, in making a speech before the Palm Beach Roundtable and during the question and answer session, the late Dr. George Carver, who at the time was a senior retired CIA official, a PhD from Oxford, a graduate of Yale University, and considered the most highly decorated CIA official at the time, confirmed publicly during the question and answer session in front of about 400 people before the Palm Beach Roundtable that the rumor that I heard as a cadet back in 1973 was absolutely true. That was the first time that I'm aware of, at least, that an insider, especially an insider like Dr. Carver, an inside the intelligence community type individual, confirmed on the public record that indeed the CIA had very intriguing spy satellite images of what appeared to be a bow of a huge ship sticking up out of the glacier on Mount Ararat. And Dr. Carver related to me that when I asked him that question that day on March 11th, 1993, before the Palm Beach Roundtable, he said he immediately recalled back in 1973 a morning breakfast meeting at Langley, CIA headquarters, a meeting with the senior hierarchy of the CIA. At the time, Dr. Carver was a senior CIA official, and they were about ready to discuss a classified matter. And he said he'll never forget when Carl Duckett, the late Carl Duckett, who at the time was Deputy Director for Science and Technology at the CIA, got up and said, "Gentlemen, before we said words of the effect, gentlemen, before we discuss that classified matter this morning, I just want to let you know one of our space-based birds, the KH-9, recently flew over Mount Ararat, and it would appear, based on the initial assessment by some of our photo interpreters, that the Noah's Ark story in the book of Genesis might be literal history." Dr. Carver said that the room immediately erupted in awe and laughter because the consensus was, gee whiz, we might have made the greatest archaeological discovery in history, and we can't talk about it publicly because it was taken by classified technology. My thinking was that if anyone on the planet knew what may or may not be up on Mount Ararat, myth, fable, or fact, for that matter, it would certainly be the CIA with its spy satellite capability. Mm-hmm. So therefore, since I heard this as a cadet at the Academy, and the Academy had a great rumor pipeline right to the Pentagon and the CIA and the White House and the like at the time, it made a lot of sense to me that there probably was potentially something man-made on Mount Ararat and potentially a nautical or naval type of construction.
Now let's jump to 2006, and we have a lot more sophisticated satellites up there. What is the latest data on size and everything that you've learned that has pushed the story forward?
We have a paradigm-busting QuickBird satellite image of the Ararat anomaly that was acquired on February 1st, 2003, at my request, pursuant to my research priorities in this project. Digital Globe, which owns QuickBird, the world's first 2-foot resolution satellite, was kind enough to fly gratis for free. These missions cost several $1,000s to fly Mount Ararat off and on for a year, and then finally the cloud cover broke. It's unfortunately, because this is at 15,300 feet, you have a constant problem with cloud cover for satellites or even for aerial, or even for planes for that matter. Cloud cover finally broke on February 1st, 2003. No clouds at all on Mount Ararat. We have a very clear, pristine, stunning image of the Ararat anomaly at 2-foot resolution, the best resolution ever for a commercial satellite. And Linda, it's a paradigm-busting image for several reasons. First, it's way too big to be the remains of the fabled, some would say factual, Noah's Ark. Every pixel in the satellite image is 2 feet. I had Rod Franz, who is a world-class, retired intelligence imaging analyst with the United States Air Force for 23 years, make an analysis of the photo and to measure the pixels using special software. And from bow to stern, if you want to call it that, from bow to stern of this formation, the structure, this anomaly, this oddity, whether it's a rock formation or something more interesting, is 1,015 feet. Virtually every biblical scholar would tell you that the ark was probably about 450 feet long, because a cubit is supposed to be about 18 inches, and 300 cubits, therefore, would be about 450 feet long. What we're looking at in the QuickBird satellite photo, astonishing as it is something that is well over 2 times that size. So that's a paradigm buster there that, gee whiz, it can't be Noah's Ark because it's way too big, so therefore it must be some kind of strange rock formation or something else. The other paradigm buster on this is that the satellite image really does show a Titanic-shaped structure, more like a modern ship and not the classical, traditional depiction of Noah's Ark as being a rectangular, unsophisticated barge, which most biblical scholars would probably agree the Ark probably looked like. This has stunning, unbroken symmetry for 1,015 feet. Then that raises another paradigm buster, and that is, well, no one knows what gopher wood is. There's certainly been a lot of speculation throughout history as to what gopher wood is, but it seems to be a very vague or ambiguous term in the Genesis record because it just says gopher wood, and there's no explanation beyond what that might be. The problem is with the anomaly that if it is some kind of nautical or naval structure of some kind, then there's no way it would float. It would break apart on the water. That this is something rivaling the size. It's as large as a modern aircraft carrier. Now, I have a naval architecture team that I've brought together in the last 3 weeks. They have spent several hours at my request on analyzing the satellite imagery and also the Genesis architectural blueprint to determine whether or not it would be feasible or possible to build some kind of vessel out of wood of this size along the structural lines of what we're seeing in the QuickBird satellite image, as well as the Iconos satellite image images from 1999 and 2009. Konos is owned by GOI. That's another company, another world-class company that has flown satellite missions for me over Mount Ararat. At 1,015 feet long, if that's the full length, and it appears to be, because it's under heavy ice and snow, the width is hard to measure because whatever this is, it is leaning heavily, maybe 30 degrees perhaps, and therefore it's hard to tell exactly what the width is because it's canted, it's at an angle. But it appears, again, each pixel being 2 feet, it does appear that this might be about 160 feet wide. Now, why is that potentially significant? Well, in the Genesis architectural blueprint, we're given 300 cubits by 50 cubits. Now, for my research purposes, a cubit is not really relevant to my analysis or my research because no one's absolutely certain as to what the size of the cubit was. What we have is 300 by 50. We have a 6-to-1 length-to-width ratio from the Genesis architectural blueprint for the proportionality between the length and the width. At 1,015 feet long and roughly 160 feet wide, we fall into a 6-to-1 length-to-width ratio, which would be in the ballpark of the biblical dimensions. Mm-hmm. Now, that might be a huge coincidence, but then again, it might be something more interesting, which is my segue to talk about the intelligence community.
Okay.
And that is for over 13 years, I have had very intriguing meetings and many conversations with intelligence community officials, including several very senior intelligence community officials, including some who are personal friends of mine or those or individuals I'm personally acquainted with about the Ararat anomaly. But I am struck also by their high interest and their actual excitement as to what they think this might be on Mount Ararat based upon high resolution spy satellite imagery of the anomaly that they have in their archives.
Why hasn't anyone gone there since we could drop a team of scientists down from a helicopter?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The vast majority of individuals and groups that have been climbing Mount Ararat off and on over the last 30 or so years have focused on the Ahura Gorge, which is 1.5 miles away on the other side of the mountain, and not this anomaly site, which is the CIA's anomaly site, which is at 15,000. The correct site is 15,300 feet on this corner on the western plateau of Mount Ararat. So when I first got involved, I was surprised, and to this day, I am surprised I'm not aware of anyone. There might be someone, but I'm not aware of anyone out there who has actually gone up to the site and reached out and touched this anomaly and confirmed it's just a bunch of ice or a bunch of strange rocks or something more interesting. Yes, there's been private photographs of this from various distances, but I'm not aware of anyone who's got even close enough with a camera actually to definitively determine what this may or may not be. My goal and my initial phase, I'm in phase 1 still of my project, is using satellite archaeology to get clear enough satellite imagery of the anomaly to push over center that a layperson or world-class scientists, and some who I've got on my team whose names I cannot mention, but to push over center those who doubt or don't think that there might be something at the site. Not push away the Noah's Ark issue, but the whole issue boils down, is there something at this site?
Can you tell me about then what is your next research step?
My next step is I've got a naval architecture team that's come together, and as I said, they are analyzing the imagery. In the next 12 months, 3 new commercial birds are going to be flying from Vandenberg Air Force Base, taking this all to a much higher resolution level. We're talking about half meter, going from 2 foot to half meter resolution with 2 of these satellites, and then also Canada's radar satellite is going down to from 8 meters to 3 meters, and I've asked all 3 companies to fly Mount Ararat on their calibration missions, and we will see what they say over the next 12 months or so, and that will help make Mount Ararat more transparent to the discerning eyes of secular, dispassionate scientists. I'm still in phase 1 of my project. I've never had any interest of even going to Turkey or even touching Mount Ararat at this point.
You're hoping that it would provoke others perhaps to do that?
Absolutely.
Professor Taylor sent me this photograph from February 1st, 2003, And I have it at my news website, earthfiles.com, in this story about this anomaly on Mount Ararat that has been photographed by satellites and is unknown. And Willie, when you look at this in the context of this conversation with Professor Taylor, you can say, well, it could be like a very long boat-like object upside down covered by this glacier. It is definitely quite smooth and seems to have a very specific deep shape. On the other hand, your mind can look at it and say it is just the glacier coming over this particular plateau with shadow and light on it. And you can see, looking at this, that it's not definitive unless scientists actually go there. And to me, one of the biggest puzzles is if the CIA in 1973 had taken a photograph that was discussed privately then as perhaps being something that was structural on that western plateau, that why is it that here in 2006, all these years, that privately somebody, or even scientifically, the CIA didn't get somebody to go there, work with the Turkish government, and discover something that would historically perhaps be significant, even if it's a big fort underneath there, something else, whatever it is, if it is an anomaly, why has no one been there? I find that to be a puzzle, and Professor Taylor agreed that part of his frustration is that there needs to be something more definitive, but there's another problem, that it has not been always conducive for the the Turkish government to have people go, especially Americans, go into that part of the world. There have been church investigations. And right now, I would think that the Turkey-American relationships would be good. So here is the question. There are anomalies all over that mountain that people have tried to investigate, and here is one that apparently, a photograph which we still haven't seen, hiding in the CIA archives, that provoked everything that you've heard from Professor Taylor today on Dreamland, that is culminating in that February 1, 2003 photograph, which he has provided, and I have at Earthfile.
Well, Linda, all I can say is thank you very much. And folks, stay tuned. There hopefully will be a second chapter to this story sooner or later, because it would be remarkable if such an enormous archaeological artifact turned out to be on Mount Ararat, whatever its origin. But don't miss a single edition of Dreamland next.
Vibration in the air, but I know exactly what you're talking about, Joshua. A good friend of Dreamland is Sir Lawrence Gardner. He's a well-known British author, and at one of his talks, he waxed, just poetic about the time of that post-World War II London and how difficult life was and the drudgery of life, that all the American kids were going to university, but here they had to work to support his family, and all of a sudden, here comes a new kind of music led by Elvis. And at that instant, it really clicked for me how much this really meant to people and how much that changed people. And that was Lawrence's point, that he traces his spiritual evolution back to that moment when all of a sudden this new vibe started to spread around the world.
Mm-hmm. It's remarkable as well when you think that today it's a commonplace thing to find classes on yoga, courses on meditation. My course at Hofstra on mysticism isn't really all that far-fetched. Back then, when George Harrison was still just embarking on his spiritual journey back in the mid to late 60s, you could open up a newspaper and not find one ad for a yoga class. I mean, that stuff was very far out back then. So George really needs to be credited for having put a lot on the line, his credibility, his fame, his success, his following. When he started publicly talking about the power of chanting, like you mentioned earlier, the Hare Krishna mantra, the Krishna consciousness that he started to get into, and then the other form.
About a wonderful new book, Here Comes the Sun, the spiritual and musical journey of George Harrison. George Harrison went on a remarkable spiritual journey, died at the age of 58 of cancer, but left behind a legacy of spiritual search that we think is going to interest you very much. And remember how important this legacy was. It resonated through our world, through the music of the Beatles and of George Harrison in a huge way. So this is an important journey. It's important for those of us who are seeking in this direction to understand just what happens when a seeker like George Harrison connects with the public, the energy of the large-scale public. Now, for our subscribers, I have been, as I've said before, struggling for some time to try to get into words some of the more unusual and difficult things that I have experienced. Particularly now, I have focused on time travel and movement through time because as improbable, as impossible as this seems, it seems also to be a feature of my experience and a feature of the experience of many other people who have had sort of lives at the edge of reality. And when something happened a few weeks ago that was so huge in this area for me, the first really gigantic experience I've had in quite a few years, well, I thought it was time to start talking about it. So for subscribers, I will be talking about my experiences with time travel. Now, here's William.
People want to know, how can I make a difference in the world? How can I change things? I'm just a little person in a big world. What are some steps that I can do? One quote-unquote little man from Liverpool, England, picked up a guitar one day, a relatively simple act. He joined with a few friends who called themselves the Beatles, and together they became a singular force that changed the world. Like the sacred Khepera beetle of ancient Egypt, they pushed the light of the sun into our world. Everyone knows the ringing chang of the first chord of A Hard Day's Night. Rolling Stone calls it the most famous chord in all of rock and roll. That chord is rock and roll. It is a holy grail chord of and for the ages, and it was a wake-up call. That chord had the tones, the words, the harmonics to create the energy that jump-started the spiritual pulse of a generation and catapulted us into a transformative timeline, which continues to this very day. That chord came through George Harrison's famous Rickenbacker 360 12-string electric guitar, but our guest today will give us inspiration to wonder if it originally came from a deeper place, a connection that George Harrison had to Krishna consciousness, to God consciousness, Christ consciousness, enlightenment, a connection that his soul treasured and now carries into another realm. Joshua Greene is a historian, an Emmy Award-nominated author and filmmaker who knew George Harrison. His book, Here Comes the Sun, explores the spiritual and musical journey of Harrison. Joshua currently teaches mysticism and the spiritual quest at Hofstra University, and this conversation today will not be about the Beatles or other crap, as Harrison might have called it. It will be about a soul's journey, the intimate story of a little man who reached the pinnacle of earthly success and found that there was more to life than untold riches and messianic fame. Joshua, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you, and thank you for that extraordinary introduction as well. That was beautiful.
Well, thank you, sir. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. Just for your background knowledge, we cover a lot of ground on Dreamland: UFOs, mysticism, spirituality, mythology, planetary awakening. So please feel free to express yourself in the deepest sense of the word.
Well, thank you. It's nice to find a soulmate at the other end of the line.
Terrific. There are more than 1,000 books, you note, about the Beatles. In checking Google this morning, there's over 18,800,000 web pages chronicling their lives. That's compared to the 29 million for the life of Jesus Christ. We just can't seem to get enough of this transformation that was sparked in the early 1960s. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, that was an extraordinary time that will never happen again for a number of reasons. Not only was there a development historically in modes of thought. Remember the time. This is just 20 years after the end of World War II, and the baby boomers, as that crop of post-war children have come to be known, were seeking alternative forms of resolution to conflict. They didn't want to have to turn to war anymore to resolve differences. So there was already an openness to peaceful cultures such as that from India. There was also an explosion of technology. When the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, there were only 3 networks at the time. So most of the country was already focused on watching that show. The same thing happened in England. They appeared on television at a time when there was really only one popular show to watch, especially on a cold winter night. That was the Beatles' debut in England on television. So there were those influences. There was also an influence that I think we can't quite describe as empirically, and that's an evolution of consciousness. The Beatles came along at a time when we were ready for other modes of thinking and feeling and being. Science and technology hadn't exactly played themselves out, but they had proven themselves to be fallible soldiers, if you will, against the adversities of life. And here we had young men riding above the wave of all of the paranoia of the time, the Vietnam War, the Kennedy assassination, the King assassination, all of these things were taking place on a conscious level. And here they were riding above that with a sense of joy and happiness about life. That was absolutely irresistible. I don't know. I wonder if it's possible for someone who wasn't growing up as I was. How old are you, William? I'm 55. How old are you?
You're 55. Yeah, I was born in 1962, so I kind of rode the wave of all you need is love with the